I believe that it is reductionist to paint a wholly positive or a wholly negative image of this development. In her essay, The Long Civil Rights Movement in the Political Uses of the Past, historian Jacqueline Hall argues, for instance, that the dominant narrative of the civil rights movement as a short movement or a short story of progress and moral enlightenment, for instance, that the story is basically false or inaccurate. Instead, she argues that the modern struggle for black equality is one that goes back at least to the progressive and radical milieu of the late 1930s. And so, there are instances in which, one can argue that there has been, improvement with respect to the situation of blacks in the US. One important thing I think I need to emphasize is that Jacqueline Dowd Hall also argues that the modern struggle for black equality has always been shaped by what she calls a dialectic of movement and the so-called backlash against it. So as much, for instance, as it is true that the situation of blacks has improved in the US insofar as, for instance, discrimination in public spaces has been outlawed, it is also true that the revamping of the US penal state, for instance, has ensured the continuation of discrimination in post-racial forms. Or another example, as much as it is true that there's been an increase of the black middle class or even of affluent blacks, it is also true that post-industrial restructurings and economic or deregulation has also led to an increase of what sociologist Loic Vacan defines or calls surplus population. So people who cannot sell their labor and have thus essentially lost their human value from an economic standpoint. Mm-hmm. So again, I think it is important to differentiate when it comes to assessing the situation of blacks in the U.S. So I believe that when we talk of structural racism, or maybe to use a more technical word, social inequality, we basically talk of the unequal distribution of chances. So the unequal distribution of the chance to fair and adequate housing, unequal distribution of the chances to access to education, unequal distribution of the chances to health and to jobs and fair salaries or adequate salaries, and in extreme cases also an unequal distribution of the chance to life. So since all of the realms or aspects I've just mentioned basically make up everyday people's everyday experience, I would say that African Americans who are disproportionately disadvantaged when it comes to all these chances, that structural racism or the unequal distribution of chances basically shapes their everyday life. They're basically disadvantaged in all aspects of their daily lives. So again, sociologist Loic Vacan reminds us of the fact that slavery was put in place in the U.S. before democracy was formed. So when we speak of African Americans or the experience of African Americans in the U.S., we basically speak of a group of people who never really were intended to become part of the civil society. So, with all the conflicts, for instance, when it comes to social justice and the failing of courts to indict or convict, police officers who have killed African Americans, what we see there again is a state trying to grapple with the problem of how to incorporate a group of people into its civil structure that have never been that were never intended to be part of the structure in the first place. Again, Martin Luther King has reminded us that if you that the problem of race in the U.S. or of racial oppression in general is not a sectional problem. So if we think of, again, Jacqueline Dot Hall, for instance, she argues that people who are marginalized on the basis of base are like the miner's cannery, insofar as that their distress is the first sign of a danger that threatens us all. So again, structures of racial inequality and of oppression are not only issues that should concern Black people, but white people as well. And what people in Germany, especially white Germans, could do to sort of not make a difference with respect to the Black Lives Matter movement, but maybe to extend the movement is, again, extend the Black Lives Matter movement to Germany and get involved in networks and organizations that have dedicated themselves to the struggle for Black human rights. So the Initiative for Black People in Germany, ISD, Initiative Schwarze Menschen in Deutschland, for instance, is such a network, and another network is Breaking the Silence, so an organization dedicated to Uri Yalo, and I think he was from Sierra Leone, asylum seeker who was killed in a prison cell in Dachau in 2005, I believe. So all of these networks and organizations are there basically to improve, the situation of Blacks, not only in the U.S., but also in Germany. And I think it is important for, Germans, basically no matter what color, to extend the activist philosophy of the Black Lives Matter movement to their countries.